Warning, the following program has been rated T for truth.
You can't handle the truth!
Oh, we think you can. Welcome to the Naked Truth Report with your host, truth warrior and mythbuster Kathleen Wells. The place where we distinguish fact from fiction, where data is used to drive points home, and where Kathleen takes the position that Democrats and black politicians have destroyed Black America. Welcome to the Naked Truth Report. Now, your host, Kathleen Wells.
Welcome to the Naked Truth Report. Happy New Year. Oh, I said that last week. Happy New Year again. I'm excited to have my guest. He's a regular guest on my show, Professor Wilfred Reilly, who teaches political science at Kentucky State University, and he's written a new book. In fact, I read it and I liked it very much. In fact, I actually wrote a blurb for the book, and it's chock full of data. It's a good thing. It's called Taboo. Professor Reilly was on before discussing his previous book, Hate Crime Hoax. Well, this book, Taboo, goes over the things that the left has done to American culture and society. So why don't I bring Professor Reilly on right now, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty. Hi, Professor Reilly. Welcome to the Naked Truth Report.
Hi to you. Glad to be back.
I'm glad to have you back. Well, let's get in. The first thing I would like to ask you before we get into your book is, we're in a new decade now. So the question is, what was the biggest blunder or mistake that the media made in last year, 2019? What do you think?
There were, I'm really tempted to respond to that just by yelling, Epstein didn't kill himself. But in all seriousness, I mean, there were a number. This actually ties into the last book I wrote, which was Hate Crime Hoax, looking at a lot of these media-created racial sensations, whether you're talking about Jussie Smollett or Covington Catholic, Barbecue Becky, the dreadlock chopping case in Washington, D.C. I would say that the biggest stumble from the media was probably Jussie Smollett. I don't personally object. I mean, that helped put my book on the bestseller list for a while. But the universal, or close to them at least, but the universal coverage of this was that this innocent man, a young black actor, had been attacked by people wearing MAGA hats, carrying a noose, a knotted rope noose, a gallon bottle of bleach in downtown Chicago near where I used to live. This became an international story, one of the most widely covered stories of the decade, if you look at the statistics on kind of media outreach. And it turned out that the entire thing was a fraud. Jussie Smollett simply made it up, and this should have been very evident from the start. I mean, in the Chicago neighborhood where he claimed to have been attacked, it turns out that I believe 91% of the people who voted for Hillary Clinton. So that was just a story that was ridiculous from the outset, but that was made into kind of one of the quote-unquote race relations crises of the century. So that'd get my vote, but there are a lot of close contenders. Covington Catholics right up there in terms of media mistakes, quite a few of them.
Right. Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Your book, what motivated you to write Taboo? That's the first question.
Well, one of the responses I got to Hate Crime Hoax that surprised me a little bit was not so much a focus on any of the chapters dealing with different types of hoax hate crimes, whether from the left or from the alt-right, but focus almost on the introduction of the book, where I go into what I call the CON, the continuing oppression narrative, and I talk about some of the ideas that underlie why people falsify these crimes. And what I did with Taboo was kind of write up the CON into a book. So the pitch line for the book is that these are the 10 things you're not supposed to talk about at dinner parties. And so on. I don't get too much into religion, but I mean, for example, can men become women is one of them. Did Black Lives Matter have a point? I mean, did the Black Lives Matter movement say anything that was valid, or did they essentially increase racial tensions and get a lot of people killed? And I go through 10 of these points. Does white privilege exist? Is cultural appropriation real? I also take on the alt-right, again, the idea of extreme nationalism. But that entire structure for the book came originally from the intro of the last book I wrote. I was amazed that so many people were interested not in the theme of the book itself, but in this question of what is this sort of storyline that seems to underlie a lot of the things we see in this country, that seems to be responsible for some of these narratives like we should open the borders. What is all that? I haven't really seen a well-written book about this, and so I decided to write one to the best of my abilities.
Yeah, well, you make the provocative statement in your book that racism really has nothing to do with the major problems facing Black Americans, despite what leftist ideology the left says, or despite what organizations like Black Lives Matters say. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure, yeah. And the one clarification I'd make, because that's a good analysis, is contemporary racism. I mean, I would assume that, for example, some things like Black people are more concentrated in the center cities. I mean, those do relate to racism in the past. It was harder to move to the suburbs as an upper middle class Black American. I don't think either of us denies that there was racism. But essentially what I say, this is chapter 5, is that racism today, the stuff that we hear about, white privilege, for example, has almost nothing to do with some of the problems that we see in the Black community, like an illegitimacy rate, a fatherlessness rate that's currently approaching 75%. And I give 3 pieces of evidence for that. I mean, point number 1 is many of these problems were much less severe when racism was much worse. When blacks and whites were literally fighting in the street with sticks, neither group had an illegitimacy rate that was over 20%. That's just a fact. So whatever you might think of ethnic conflict, I hate it. That doesn't necessarily seem to have a lot to do with some of the things we're seeing today. Drug use is another one. Gang banging is another one. So on down the line. Second piece of evidence, Black immigrant groups and Asian immigrant groups as well don't really seem to have these problems. So if this even needs to be said, there's nothing genetically wrong with Blacks or Easterners. I mean, if you look at the highest performing groups in the country, you've got West Indians who are almost all Black, Nigerians, of course, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans. So why aren't American Blacks doing this? Again, racism can't be responsible. And the third thing that I say is that we see these same problems among poor whites, who may be the most universally ignored group in this country. So I live in Kentucky, and if you want to talk about high rates of drug use, teen pregnancy, suicide, I mean, it would be hard to beat some of these urban white communities, Lexington, for example, when it comes to those statistics, the Appalachian region of the state. So what I say is that if we're seeing these patterns in Black communities today, and we didn't see these patterns in Black communities in the 50s, whether or not Blacks and whites sometimes fought each other, and we do see these patterns in poor white communities today, we need to unpack what's really happening. And what's really happening isn't just old school racism never went away. The more we focus on dealing with old school racism, the more time we waste, because that doesn't have much of anything to do with a lot of these issues. These issues didn't exist in the 50s, didn't exist in the 60s.
Right. And one data point that you have in your book is that in the 30s, Black Americans had 89% two-parent families. And in fact, you even said during slavery, I think it was 75% of all the children were born to the same parents during slavery.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
So you can't get more. You can't get more racism than slavery, and yet most of those slave kids, the kids that were born in slavery, were born to both parents. 75%. How did you find that data point?
Just did a lot of research. I mean, I have a research associate, Jane Lingle. I have students at my university that want to study with me. I'm a pretty good researcher myself. So we just really sat down with the books, put the computers away some days, went to the library, looked up old Tom Sowell. Where's this book? Time on the Cross. Some of the books that actually break down what happened during the slave era. That's going over to a bookshelf here. That's Robert Fogel and Stanley Ingerman. That actually breaks down what happened during quote unquote slavery time in America. So they don't ignore the brutality, but they also compare, the life expectancy of slaves to that of Irishmen during the time. They were about the same. But I just read a lot of the historical sources for this. And you're absolutely right. Black people, like human beings in general, are strong, are resilient. There were institutions like the Christian church in Black slave communities that were kind of a source of light as much as could be possible. So under slavery, I mean, there was a created marriage tradition, jumping the broom, that combined European and African ideas ideas. 75% of kids were born into two-parent, usually married families. So no one's defending slavery. No one's saying slavery was good. And the illegitimacy rate for whites at the time was only about 5%. So, of course, there was some difference caused by this brutalization. But never in the history of the world until the modern welfare states have you seen 70% of the kids for blacks or 40% for whites being born into fatherless situations. That's never happened. Racism is as old as humankind.
Right. You know, and I talk about that frequently on the radio show. That's and you know, Larry Elder does too. The breakdown of the family is the breakdown of the community and the society and the culture. And in fact, that's something that Dr. Claude Anderson, and it's not just blacks. I mean, blacks are the highest percentage, but it's impacting all groups. This liberal ideology is impacting the family structure of all American groups.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, so first of all, I don't, and obviously you don't either, I don't make excuses about issues in the black community. So yeah, we're in the lead. But I mean, if you look at fatherlessness across different groups, I mean, you're talking about 73% for blacks, Native Americans about the same, honestly. Hispanics, it's 56%. That includes white Hispanics, sizable number of Hispanics are just white. Whites, 35%. The only group where it's not a complete disaster is Asian Americans, where, as I recall, that's 11%. So Asian immigrants seem to be keeping their families together. But for everybody else, I mean, you're talking about 50% fatherlessness rate. So yeah, this is becoming an American problem. It's also a problem in the European welfare states, by the way. So in Sweden, you've got about a 40% illegitimacy rate. Anytime you give people the same amount of money you can make it a decent job, $10 or $11 an hour for not doing anything, you're going to get a lot of people not doing anything.
And you even have a chapter in the book called Suiting Up for the Culture War. So essentially, the leftist ideology has adversely impacted our culture. It's a culture war against traditional values. And one of the traditional values is the family.
Yeah, I think that there's a temptation among a lot of edgy elite people, both the working class tough kids I grew up with in quote unquote the hood, upper middle class, you know, extreme sports types or law student soldiers. There's a temptation, if you're tough and funny, to kind of mock the middle class, like those staid, boring people that go on a couple dates before they'll sleep with you and work 9 to 5. But in reality, a society can't function if everybody's an edgy predator. Basic bourgeois values are necessary for society to run well. And this is even little things. Like, I've traveled pretty extensively in Latin America because I'm brown and se habla español. And one of the first things I noticed when I got down there is that people just ignore the traffic lights. You'll be driving along, it's a straight red light, someone will speed through it to get to their appointment or whatever, and that makes it pretty dangerous to cross the road after a few drinks the night before or to go out for a morning jog. And looking at that, you realize this is one reason things don't necessarily function all that well in some of these countries. You need to have basic rules. Like, if you get someone pregnant, whether or not you intended that, yeah, you consider a marriage or you figure out what you're going to do. You probably just get married. And as that collapses, as we see more people taking on these kind of edgy, revolutionary ideas, you see a fraying of the social fabric. And yeah, I think that's true for blacks. I think that's true for whites. It's pretty problematic.
And you say that the left doesn't seek solutions, but creates permanent turmoil. And that's also, you know, you have turmoil when you don't have a family.
Well, yeah, I mean, so this is actually, yeah, this to me, and we've talked about this before. I've talked to Larry specifically about this. This turned out to be a big part of my segment on his show. I don't think either of us intended this. But the biggest problem in the black community today is fatherlessness. It's not close. I mean, racism, okay, I don't deny that there's sectors where racism can have, say, a 5% impact on your life or something like that. But if you think about that for a second, that means instead of making $50,000, I make $45,000. You can live on that. Obviously, we should fight racism, but that's very different from the collapse that goes along with a total absence of families or 14-year-olds getting pregnant. That doesn't have a damn thing to do with racism. You could be engaged in a competition with the other man with both of you landing some blows, and not get someone pregnant and leave your kid who's of the same race. So, I mean, if you look at, for example, National Center for Fathering, if you look at some of the statistics, I want to say 15 times, that may be a slight exaggeration, but much, much more likely to go to prison if you don't have a father in the home. As a young woman, you're much more likely to become sexually promiscuous. That's not just a stereotype. You're much more likely to get pregnant young. Both sexes, you're much more likely to use drugs, commit suicide. So when we look at some of these problems, like a 60% illegitimacy rate for poor whites, 70 for blacks, we need to resolve that before we start talking about this other stuff, like, well, those two groups sometimes fight each other. I think that problem number 2 is much less serious than problem number 1, the beam in mine eye and all that.
Right. No, I agree with that. And you say that the Democratic Party uses identity politics as a ticket to power. Andrew Yang, okay, the issue, the Democrats are having a debate, I think this coming Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, next week. And this issue that there's no people of color, I hate that term, people of color, but which encompasses all non-white folks, I guess, And they even listen, I heard people calling into C-SPAN calling Persians people of color. Can you imagine? Persians are not people of color. But anyway, I mean, everything, they've just blurred the lines. Isn't that a song, Blurred Lines? They've just distorted everything. Nothing means anything anymore. Words have no meaning. But anyway, getting back to the Democratic debate, Andrew Yang was complaining, and also Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, that there are no more people of color that will be on the debate stage. As if, you know what I'm saying? As if that's relevant. But they use it because it's not about someone's color. It's about what their issues, their thoughts are, their values, their standards. And the Democratic Party never talks about the fact that they destroyed the family. That's why there are problems.
So, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, first of all, I agree with you on people of color. That's an extremely broad label. It would include everyone from South Asian Indians to African Americans to Native American tribesmen and so on. And I mean, just thinking about how that works in day-to-day life. I mean, if you're in South Central Los Angeles and a black guy walks into a Korean guy's store, they may both be good guys, but it's not like they're going to slap each other in the back and yell, "Hey, teammate."
Right.
I mean, there are major issues between minority communities with some points on both sides. And I do think...
And in fact, I just want to interrupt. Where I live in Leimert Park, there's a Starbucks there, and the Somalians and Eritreans, how do you say Eritreans? I don't know how, I can't pronounce. They don't interact. They're speaking their language. They're not interacting with Black Americans, okay? And when you I went to Westfield Mall, it used to be the Fox Hills Mall. You don't see Black, everyone in there is Latino, hiring Latinos. You don't see Black folks working that much in the Westfield Fox Hills Mall. When I grew up, when I was a teenager, that mall was being built, and a lot of Blacks were always in the mall working there. You don't see that anymore, okay? Most of the people that work in that mall are not Black.
Well, there are a lot of questions there. I mean, one of the things that's most interesting, because, I mean, we both lean right, we're passionate, the Democrats a little here. One of the things that's most interesting about Democratic immigration policy is the idea that Black people should support unlimited open borders immigration because we're all people of color.
Right,
and
exactly.
I love my Hispanic cousins, but I think that's an odd approach. I mean, we're specifically an urban community, not really poor in Appalachian terms, not really rich, but a working class community. I mean, concentrated in areas where there's a lot of, for example, construction work, automobile work, landscaping work. So saying that we should favor massive working class immigration doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I think the whole idea with that African Americans and white union men should support illegal immigration. The only way in which that's logical is in the context of this idea of a coalition of the fringes. Like, the left is everyone but white men in suits. And what unifies this group is the desire to beat the white men in suits who are the oppressors.
Right.
And that's why there's so much backlash if you start pointing out some of these things, like how on board is the Black community, especially the Black church, with, say, transgenderism. Mm-hmm. If you say that, the immediate reaction is going to be, well, you're talking like a colonizer. You're trying to break up And it's like, no, I'm a black
Right.
man. I have some questions here. But,
Right.
I mean, you're trying to break up, the coalition. You're trying to stop what needs to be
Right.
done. You could
I mean, I
like,
want to see these black church women voting for Buttigieg. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I want to see that happen. I hope he gets the nomination. I want to see Donna Brazile and all these church-going black women voting for Buttigieg. All these black women that don't have a husband voting for. vote.
Oh, Buttigieg has a loving husband, apparently.
Right, no, but I hope he gets the nomination because I really want to see black church-going women voting for that man. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the logical ticket for the Democrats would have been Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I think they let those two candidates both expose themselves. I mean, Biden, I generally don't vote Democrat, but Biden 10 years ago would have been a pretty solid candidate for president. I mean,
really?
Right now yeah, obviously I don't agree with a lot of his economic policies, but in terms of Joe Biden, 20-year senator, I mean, his accomplishments, he was the person responsible for the crime bill more than, say, Clinton or Gingrich. Yeah, I think he could have run a serious campaign and done pretty well. Biden right now, one of the things about the candidates in this race is that they're all extremely old. That includes President Trump. But Biden is 79, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So you get into some real questions about whether he is still qualified. Like there's some situations where he's just started ranting and saying crazy things. Do you remember him talking about corn pop?
Yeah. I don't remember. What was it? Oh, that was some kind of experience that he had earlier with somebody named Corn Pop or something. Yeah, it was like he was like.
When I was a lifeguard. Yeah, he was talking about a fist fight he got into with a black guy when he was a lifeguard 50 years ago, and it was like one of those jokes that doesn't end. He went on with this story for a good 4 minutes, and the audience was just staring at him, baffled. But I mean, that's the issue in the Dem race right now. The guy who obviously would have been the leading candidate and a fairly solid candidate is 80. So it's him and a bunch of, maybe vice presidents or, secretaries of housing and urban development. Mm. But Buttigieg, yeah, I'll just say this in a sentence. Most of the candidates other than Biden are polling in single digits among black people. And it's not hard to see why. I mean, like, I don't think you're going to see a lot of love down at the church house for Liz Warren. I actually like Andrew Yang, but I mean, he's at 1% among black voters. So if they get anyone but Biden, and maybe if they get Biden, I mean, we'll really get a chance to see how Blexit works, because they're not going to be running a very pro-black candidate who's capable of that kind of outreach. But I can see, I don't know who's on the table for him.
Right. Well, one of the things you write in your book is that the Democrats talk a good game of unity and bipartisanship, but their every action aims to divide us into balkanized competing groups, suspicious and jealous of one another and in constant conflict. This is the way they.
Is that from my book, Taboo?
Yeah, that is Taboo. Because I wrote a blurb, so I wrote a blurb for your book, so I actually took notes on each chapter so I could write the blurb. Okay. And yes, this is from your book.
Okay, the quote might be from the notes, I think. I mentioned the Democratic Party by name only a couple of times, but the basic idea. So first of all, I'm not going to bash the Republicans as much here, but I think identity politics isn't just an American liberal thing. Identity politics is a human curse. One of the things all political scientists study is the former Yugoslavia, where you had one of the great nations. I mean, Russia's ally, our rival, the national sport was basketball, and second or third in the world, economic powerhouse. That country collapsed incredibly thoroughly. I mean, it collapsed into Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia. It would be a long, boring couple minutes if I named all these countries, Montenegro, Kosovo. Mm. But the reason for that was this kind of ethnic balkanization, literally, when you think about it, actually, in terms of where it's located. But I mean, every ethnic group during a period of conflict began demanding that their schools be taught in their own language. Criticism of the country became seen as kind of trendy. And this just went on and on and on until eventually there was a war. And you now have 7 or 8 countries at minimum.
Professor Reilly, there's my music. Let's go to the break, and we're gonna. Are you open to taking phone calls from my Truth Warriors?
Sure.
Question? Okay, we'll open up the phone lines when we come back from the break. So if you have questions for Professor Reilly, call in, and we're gonna go to a break, and we'll be right back. Beautiful. Isn't that beautiful? Listen, I'm joined with Professor Wilfred Reilly. He's written the book Taboo. Is your book, Professor Reilly, is your book published yet? Is it on the bookshelves?
Taboo's dropping officially on the 28th of January. So we're just now starting to do major media, starting to promote that. But that will be out in a couple weeks. You can pre-order it now through Amazon and so on, but it's not in bookstores yet.
Okay, I encourage you to pre-order, folks. I read it. You'll love it. It has great data in it. Like, during slavery, most kids, 75% of Black kids had both parents. In the 30s, in 1938, Black kids had, Black families, 89% of Black families were two-parent in the 30s, and 75% during slavery. Get the book and get the information. That having that knowledge is like a sword or a weapon against Democrats.
Yep.
You're armed with data. At least I think so. I mean, a lot of people feel that you need stories. Stories are the best way to fight Democrats, but I need data. How can you fight data? So one of the things you wrote in the book is that, is this what I want to say? You asked the question, at what point is it fair to judge the left on the results of their policies rather than their professed good intentions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very valid question. And this is, again, a lot of these ideas. The last chapter of the book looks at some of the negative movements on the right, like the move toward ethno-nationalism. So I think this is a valid question to ask anybody, but it's certainly valid to ask the people with what Tom Sowell called the vision of the anointed, the people that do usually lean left, that are trying to change this country in really dramatic ways. Because one of the things these people talk about a lot is sort of moral intentions. Mm-hmm. And those are good in your family life or something like that. But we really have to ruthlessly, practically look at how well government policies work. So what you see very often on that kind of political utopian left is a claim that we need policy A so we can fix problem B. Mm-hmm. So, for example, there's a lot of crime in America. A leftist utopian type might say, well, that's not because there are criminals out there. That's because we aren't dealing with the root causes of crime, like poverty and racism. Mm-hmm. So we should be kinder to criminals. We should guarantee a fairly qualified attorney if you're arrested. We should provide protections like the Miranda rights. We should make people understand that they are valued. I'm only being a little glibber. That's basically what happened in the 60s. And crime will go down. Mm. And very often what happens after the policy is passed is that problem B gets worse. Crime goes up. Right. And the defense, there are usually two defenses. One is that that's not because of the policy change. Life is complicated. You simple hicks out there don't understand it. Right. But two, even if there's people accept to some extent this is caused by the policy, the deflection is always, but we were well-intentioned. You're the cold, cruel, uncaring ones with your economic ideas. So yeah, I think we need to judge the results of things. A good example, just very quickly, is affirmative action. So the argument for affirmative action is actually a great moral argument. It is, we used to fight along racial lines in this country. Whites got the better of it. As a result, blacks were squeezed out of all these opportunities in higher education, in the workforce. What we need to do is admit black students that are much less qualified than their competitors so that they can have a fair chance. And, it sounds a little questionable. There's a moral logic behind that. But the question for me is, does this work? Have you read Mismatch?
No, I have not.
That's a book I'd recommend, since we both mentioned a few. Mismatch is by Sander and Taylor, came out in 2012, two social scientists. They look at whether affirmative action works, whether it helps get young black men and women out of college. And what they find is that it doesn't really. People are placed in these highly competitive environments, Yale, the University of Michigan, Berkeley, these, ruthless pre-law and business programs with SAT scores, say 200 points behind those of the other people in the program. And what happens is that they feel socially unpopular and fail out. There are 20 or 30 point graduation gaps between blacks and whites at most of these schools. Whereas if the same kids go to schools where they have the median SAT score, solid schools, Rice, Southern Illinois University, Eastern Michigan, something like that, they graduate in very, very large numbers. The graduation rate's about the same as it is for whites. So the question isn't, is it moral to try to make up for past racism? The question instead is, how well does affirmative action or reparations, national health care in a country as big as ours, how well do these moral ideas actually work?
Right,
what
right,
if we
right.
did what Greta Thunberg wants?
Right, right, right. Well, you know, that's that my show, The Naked Truth Report, is based on that premise. You know, look at the results. What have they succeeded at? What has liberal ideology succeeded at? What has it done? Look at what fruit has been born from these principles, these ideas that they hold dear. Another thing you wrote is that progressives have weaponized race to discredit and silence conservatives and to enhance their own power. That's very true, particularly that's very true. And you see the wielding of power with Nancy Pelosi and these articles of impeachment. Somehow holding them back is like giving her leverage of some sort.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, Pelosi just miscalculated. If I could do a minute on the impeachment, I think Pelosi didn't want to impeach. Pelosi was driven to impeach by the left wing of her own party. So you have candidates in the current Democratic caucus like Rashida Tlaib, whose most famous quote is, "Impeach the MF." I mean, her comment was that from the moment she got into Congress, she was going to try to impeach Donald Trump. She's promised that to her constituents, by my count, 5 times at local mosques and barbecues and that kind of thing. So Pelosi knew, the thing with impeachment is that the Senate's controlled by the Republicans. It's the Senate that votes on impeachment. So there was no chance that Trump would be convicted, that there'd be a permanent black mark of impeachment on his record. Not at all. So Pelosi didn't initially want to bother. When the records of the call came out, the squad, quote unquote, and other people kept hammering her. And she finally said, okay, let's hold a House hearing. They did. They have articles of impeachment. But Mitch McConnell has basically said, you know, you're kind of handing me a crap sandwich here. If you send this up, I'm going to send it down. We're going to free Trump in 3 weeks. So Pelosi is now in the position of refusing to send the articles up because she says there won't be a fair trial. She's grandstanding a little bit. But the simple fact is Trump is probably not even formally impeached until the Senate sees the articles. This is just silly. So all we're really doing now is biding time. I guess if the Democrats get a 2/3 majority of the House and the Senate, we might see Trump convicted. Other than that, this is just a waste of time.
Right. Why don't we take a call now from Raul? Hi, Raul. Welcome to the Naked Truth Report. You have a question for Professor Reilly? Hello? Oh, is he on the line? Raul?
Hello?
Yeah, Raul. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yes. Kathleen, were you going to be discussing the debate?
I'm sorry?
Were you going to be discussing the debates? I talked to your screener, and I noticed you were discussing the debates earlier.
Well, yeah, I mean, do you have a question for Professor Reilly?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, do you have a question for Professor Reilly? He's my guest. Why don't you ask him a question about the debates?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, why don't they challenge Vice President Joe Biden on this quid pro quo that he was bragging about? I don't know why they don't have the courage to challenge him in front of the American people and make him explain what the hell happened here. Because you're going to elect this guy. I mean, he's going to be nominated, and not one of these people. I thought maybe Tulsi Gabbard, because when she challenged, Harris on this marijuana thing, she derailed her campaign, man. Now, why doesn't I was hoping she would challenge him on this quid pro quo.
Right. So, Professor Reilly, Raul's asking, why don't the other Democrat candidates challenge Biden on this quid pro quo deal that he had going on with his son getting a gig in Ukraine with Burisma?
That's a good question. I think the answer is kind of the mainstream of the party has pretty much said that's off limits. Obviously, coming from that sort of professional political science perspective, there are smoke-filled rooms. I mean, there are things that the DNC is going to tell some of the lead guys at your campaign. It's going to be bad for you if you do, if that makes sense. And I think that every time that's come up, I mean, so Biden, for example, Biden's accused Trump of QPC, quid pro quo. But what makes this ridiculous is Biden himself an old varsity player, and he's done this probably more than Trump. So, I mean, there are all these situations where Biden told Ukraine they wouldn't get a couple $2 billion in aid unless they fired one of their prosecutors who he called a son of a bitch. And the audience laughed. That's not much has been said about that. Hunter Biden, Biden's son, who's been arrested for smoking crack, was on the board of a Ukrainian oil gas company. And like the Russian gas industry is serious business. Hunter Biden doesn't know anything about gas extraction. So yeah, that stuff happened. Frankly, I think the candidates have been told not to talk about it or been advised not to talk about it. Same thing with Elizabeth Warren not being Indian. I think that the campaign staffs behind the scenes have said, okay, there's some things that we're not going to bring forward because we want to get the candidate up against Trump. I mean, Bernie Sanders had a heart attack on stage while campaigning. And, obviously wish him all good health and so on. But that's something no one's pointed out. The one candidate
he didn't have a heart attack on stage.
He was walking off. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but this is a guy, he had a heart attack. It's unfortunate, obviously. We don't want anyone in either political party to die while campaigning. But, I mean, there clearly are things that you could bring up that people aren't. The one person who has been, by the way, is Tulsi. That's why Tulsi is not on the debate stage, right? I mean, you keep seeing... I think that there is an attempt to get Tulsi Gabbard and Andy Yang off the stage.
Yeah.
I mean, you see this sort of maneuvering like, yeah, well, she's over 5% in 17 polls, but not the 3 we use. So I think Tulsi might bring that up, but Tulsi's going to be in another debate after she's just KO'd 2 or 3 candidates in a row. Hillary Clinton also.
Well, Kathleen, are you still, am I still on the air?
Yeah, you're still on the air, Raul.
Can I ask you? The professor, his opinion on the fact that the DNC didn't allow Fox to host one of those debates. I think that is un-American. That's anti-freedom of speech. I think that's a freedom of the press. To not allow Fox because they don't agree with them or they're afraid that Fox is going to ask some real tough questions.
Yeah, how do you feel about that, Professor Reilly? That the DNC didn't allow Fox to hold the debate.
I actually agree with Raul. I think that's un-American. I think that's ridiculous. Ideally, I would like to see Salem Communications host every Democratic debate and MSNBC host every Republican debate. I'd like to see the toughest questions imaginable asked to our politicians, many of whom are crooks. I mean, so if Joe Biden really did, if Joe Biden's son unethically obtained a board directorship at a massive foreign company, that's something that should be asked. So I think the toughest questions possible to the candidates are a good idea. So yeah, it's ridiculous. So there's a lot here. One of the big problems in the USA right now is the control of media, and that does come mostly from the left. So, I mean, I realized recently that almost everyone I used to argue with had been kicked off Twitter and every other similar platform. Alex Jones and the conspiracy theory guys, Jared Taylor and the entire alt-right, people that were just seen as mildly edgy like Milo Yiannopoulos, Laura Loomer, the real black activists like Minister Farrakhan, all the ADOS people, all these people were gone. And that was a decision that coincidentally every large social media company made within an hour of one another on the same day.
Oh, those folks are all off Twitter?
All of them. Yeah, they're all gone. I mean, who else did they get rid of? Cop blocks?
That's censorship. They're impacting our First Amendment, right?
Yeah, they literally deleted Jared Taylor and Louis Farrakhan within an hour of one another. Whatever you might think of either man, there really are people that have massive monopoly control over information.
Yeah.
So do I think that the left-wing party should refuse to go on a center-right television network? No, I think that's absolutely ridiculous.
Okay, thank you, Raul, for calling in.
Oh, no, thank you, folks. Have a good night.
Okay, have a good night.
Sure
This is the other thing I wanted to mention is that you say it's frightening how quickly radical extremists took control of the Democratic Party and faced little resistance. Can you sort of touch on that for about 3 minutes?
Sure. Yeah, well, what we've seen is intense political polarization in the USA in recent years. And that has been especially noticeable up to this point on the left. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious. If you look at the Squad, for example, you have people, well, actually, I'll just break this down to one survey if we've got 3 minutes. There was a study recently that looked at young Americans. You can find this just by Googling young Americans prefer socialism. They asked young guns, both sexes in the United States, would you prefer to live in a capitalist country or a socialist country? Would you prefer to live in a country with the demographics we have now, or a majority-minority country, a country with gun rights, or an unarmed country? And the majority of young people, at least who leaned left, said that they would rather live in a socialist, majority-minority, unarmed country. Majority-minority doesn't really matter much to me one way or another, but the other two are a dramatic shift from anything that we've ever been in the past. And for a bunch of reasons, cough, indoctrination early on in the schools, cough, a lot of people coming up into the progressive political movement feel this way. So yeah, there's a big difference between Tip O'Neill going back and forth with Ronald Reagan, or Clinton and Gingrich working out a welfare deal, and say Ilhan Omar on one side of the spectrum and Donald Trump on the other side of the spectrum. We've gotten much further apart, and you notice that especially on the left side of the dial. And the question is not even, is that happening? Yes, it is. It's what we're going to do about it. Will we be able to stay together as one people?
Well, Professor Reilly, I appreciate you. I'm gonna have you on again because we can delve into some more stuff. Okay, I'm gonna have you on soon. Okay, so I appreciate you being here. I'm speaking with, my guest was Professor Wilfred Reilly, who is a political science professor at Kentucky State University. His new book, which you can pre-order on Amazon, is Taboo. I encourage you to get it. I read it. It's chock full of information. You'll enjoy it. Taboo. Pre-order it at Amazon. Thank you, Professor Reilly.
All right. Thanks a lot for having me.
Okay, thanks. So now we're going to, one thing I want to say is if there are any folks out there that would like me to come speak at your organization or your event or something like that, go to my website, thenakedtruthreport.com, and you can send me a note. Yeah, I'd like to do that. Also, I want to mention, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. That's the Naked Truth Report YouTube channel. And also you can purchase the t-shirts. Remember, I have those great t-shirts. You go to my website page, and I have t-shirts that say the Democrat voters :R, shallow, superficial, what else do I, unknowledgeable, things like that. I also have a t-shirt that says the media is the problem. Oh, and I have another t-shirt that says the Democratic Party destroyed Black America. That's a great one. So that's one thing. Go subscribe to my YouTube channel, join my Twitter page, Wells Kathleen, and also go purchase a t-shirt. So I'll see you next week. Thank you, Truth Warriors and Mythbusters. I appreciate it.